أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome everyone to session 6 of the podcast on eschatology. And what I want to look at today, inshallah, are the various sciences and requisite knowledges of eschatology. Sciences that you need to have at least a working knowledge of in order to really get into this science and to benefit from it. Otherwise, you will definitely end up making incredible mistakes, some that even reach borderline kufr and may even take you into shirk if you are not careful. Because as we say, that eschatology is largely an interpretive science and much of it is metaphysical in nature. It's unseen. You can't deal with it empirically. And for this reason, a lot of it is based on how your intellect is exerted, how much intellection you're going to put into it. And the intellect, we'll talk about this in the next session, inshallah, about the intellect. The intellect requires rules, requires guidelines, requires limits and parameters to be identified when you start exerting any amount of thought and inquiry into any subject. And that's what a science really does. It provides you with these boundaries and parameters. It also provides you with the knowledge base or the foundation. As a principle, the scholar said, min al-ma'lum ila al-majhul, whenever you're getting into something called qiyas, reasoning, asking the why questions, because it's the why question that takes you into the metaphysical realities of things. And in order to venture into that, you need to first know or start with what is ma'lum, what is known, before you go into the unknown. And that's what these requisite knowledges are for. So I'm going to go through all these different sciences in brief, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time in two of the most important of these sciences. The first of these, of course, is always going to be language. Language is the essential requisite. And it doesn't mean that you can speak a language, like you can speak English or you can speak Urdu or you can speak Arabic, so that qualifies you automatically. What it means is that you understand how the language works. And so the language itself has got its own sciences. And we're talking now about the language of the Arabs and the language of the Quran at the time that it was revealed. Because the language of the Arabs is one thing. Further to that, the Quran came in and really changed the language in many of its aspects, in its articulations, in the definition of certain words and concepts, and raised it up a higher degree. And so understanding the language and the sciences is paramount, because one of the ways in which the Quran has been preserved is by the preservation of the language and the preservation of the sciences. So in order to reach that degree of Quranic articulation, you need to at least have a certain understanding of how the sciences themselves, which preserve that language, how they operate. Now, the sciences of the Arabic language, there are actually very many of them. One of my teachers told me that there are at least 36, and he also told me that during the what's commonly known as the Islamic Golden Age, there were at least 60 of these sciences. Many of these were really specific and sort of expert sciences, really defined sciences, not the prime sciences. When I was studying Arabic language, there were at least 13 sciences that were being taught, and they were regarded as there were 15 sciences that were primarily required to be studied. And 3 of these were higher sciences. The rest of these, which are 13 sciences, were primarily taught in university. I mean, for now, I don't know. It's very strange. It's actually been reduced to now only 6 sciences, and many of these sciences have been removed. I don't know why they would do that, and why. Well, it's sort of like they're trying to diminish the importance of the study of language and sort of reduce it only to a purely analytical thing and a quantitative thing that can be applied in the mundane sciences of otherworldly craft and all that. But the science of the Arabic language, if you were to study this with a classical scholar or a scholar who holds value in tradition and the transmission of knowledge, you would begin with the science of lugha. Lugha is the language itself. the vocabulary, the words, how they're used, general speech, general language, just communication itself. Then you've got Nahu, and Nahu is really important. Nahu is often the most overlooked science in the sciences of the language, and it's essentially the most basic that you would have to study. You cannot proceed without Nahu in any of the Islamic sciences. Nahu is very interesting. The word itself, Nahu, comes from a statement that Imam Ali made. أقسام اللغة ثلاثة الاسم والفعل والحرف. And this is what's known as a universal grammar. That there are essentially three parts to language: the object, the subject, and the preposition, or the noun, the verb, and the preposition. The person who is doing the thing, the thing that is being done, the action, and then what's connecting the two together. So if I said Umar sat down, Umar is ism in this case, is the noun, and then the act of sitting is the verb, and then sat down, the down there, that's the preposition, that's the harf. And so he said, أقسام اللغة ثلاثة الاسم والفعل والحرف فنحو هذا النحو. So go this way. In other words, use this template. This is the template. And that's what grammar essentially is, if it is to be condensed in a single statement. That's what grammar is. Grammar is to do with the parts of speech, how they are put together and how they are conjugated and how they are analyzed to provide accurate speech, intelligible speech, and understandable speech. And then you've got sarf. Sarf has to do with etymology and morphology. And this is the most difficult of all these sciences in my experience and in the experience of many other linguists, because it has to really do with going deep into the origin of words. It is also associated with another science called ilm al-ishtiqaq, which is the science of derivation, examining the origin of words. Where do they originate from? Where is the root? Where is the root harf coming from? How has it been put together? The sarf, how is the morphology put together? How is it built? Where do the suffixes come in? Where do the affixes come in? How do you separate those? And then there is al-rasm, which is writing and dictation. And I found this to be one of the most deteriorating aspects of modern societies. That many people I've seen are just unable to write properly, whether in Arabic, even in English and things like this. They, just have poor handwriting. They can't, if you were to dictate a statement, they would have like spelling mistakes. They wouldn't, they'd get confused. They'd get set behind. They wouldn't be able to keep up with what's being said. In Arabic, this is very crucial, especially in the science of eschatology, because if you cannot write, because writing is part of the study. And my methodology of studying in eschatology involves a lot of writing. Every ayah that you study, you have to write down the ayah in Arabic properly in the way it has been in the way it has been written, and you have to write down your notes from that. The same goes for hadith. You have to write down the entire hadith, and that's the ilm al-rasm. Then you've got ilm al-insha, which is how to develop and arrange things like feelings, emotions, ideas, tones, descriptions into expressions. It is essentially the art of composition, or the art of expressing specific thoughts in an anticipated way, or we would say it's how the Arabs spoke, how they expressed what they were saying. Then you've got ilm al-bayan, Badi' and Ma'ani. These three fall under rhetoric. So they're sort of like sub-branches of rhetoric. Ilm al-Bayan is the articulation itself, and then Badi' is the subtlety and the nuance, the fine pieces, the things that you would pick up only if you really understood how it was being expressed. Then you've got Ma'ani, which is the meanings and how they are ascribed. Which word is used better, and why is it used like that, and why is it placed in this manner? Why is it not placed in this other manner? For instance, why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say, Alam nashrah laka sadrak? Why didn't he just say Alam nashrah sadrak? He could have said that because grammatically the statement is still sound, but he said Alam nashrah laka sadrak. He added that word in between. That's a nuance, and it's got an impact on the statement that he is giving. Then you've got the three sciences of poetry. You've got qardu shi'r, and then you've got arud, and then you've got qawafi. And so Qardu Shi'r is the science of poetry, which is to do with the art of versification, how the verses are composed. Then you've got Arud, which deal with the metrics, the pieces, the balancing pieces, and how they follow a sort of a rhythm. And then you've got Qawafi, which are the line endings or the rhyming words. Then you've got Khataba, which is the art of speaking on your feet without reading from a piece of paper. And this is something very interesting, because I found many modern scholars or imams in this case, in the masajid, they just cannot, they don't know this at all. They will be reading from a piece of paper that's obviously scripted by whatever masjid committee that has employed them, or they'll be using their cell phone, and flicking through that, or something or the other. They just cannot speak without having a referential point, something to read a speech out of. So they will write the speech down. Every imam sort of writes down their own khutbah, writes down the whole thing, and then essentially just regurgitates what they've written. I mean, I don't even know why they bother doing that. They might as well just photocopy everything and distribute it among the people. But this is a skill of speaking. And you find some of the great speakers, they always had a way of articulating, bringing out their thoughts and expressions in a most intelligible, most persuasive, and an impactful manner. Then you've got Tariq, which also goes with Adab. And this is the science of literature and the history of literature. The science of literature and the history of literature. It is to follow the life of the language from its origination, and then all the works that have been produced from that, how they've been produced, because part of the preservation of the language is in the books that have been written in that language. The books preserve the language. The literature is what preserves the language. If you have a chance to look into the history of how they composed the Oxford English Dictionary, it was very interesting. The way they did that was they sent out public notices to the people, and they asked the people to respond back with a word that they knew and a reference from where they found that word, so that they could understand its meaning in the context in which it was used. And a majority of those entries were from books that had been published, literature books that had been published. So they were able to then deduce the meanings of how those words were being used in literature, not on the street level. And then you've got Mutun al-Lugha. It's also part of literature. These are the academic works and the classical texts and treatises and these type of things. This is now where the academic aspect or the scholarly aspect of the language is preserved. The literature aspect is mostly to do with articulation, stories, narrations, poetry, these type of things. But now where the sciences are also preserved on an academic level and a scholarly level, these are the mutun or the mutun al-lugha. And these are the texts that are often studied when these sciences are being studied. So that was just sort of in a nutshell about language. And that was just the first requisite of the science of eschatology. Then you've got, and oh, by the way, you also have logic. Now, logic is important. I'm going to talk about this in a short while. Then you've got the second major science, which is Quranic sciences. And Quranic sciences also has its own sub-sciences. And I really like Ibn Juzay al-Kalbi's concise explanation of these sciences. He gives you 12 sciences that he says you need to have at least a working knowledge of, if not a mastery of, before you speak on the Quran. And this is where a lot of people make a mistake, especially now when we go into eschatology and they start pulling out all these ayat. And the same thing they do to the hadith. They start pulling out all these ayat and just start interpreting them however they feel like. They skip the language portion. They don't know the language. They will look at translations. They will look at synonyms of words and derive meanings and put those meanings in. They will look into dictionaries and select what works for them, because many of the dictionaries, especially the Islamic lexicons, they didn't give simple, straightforward words, word-to-word meanings of the words. They give expansive elaborations of how those words were used in different aspects. And some of those aspects were actually contradictory depending on the context that they were used. So they will just pick out whatever works for them and then apply it to an ayah. And that's where, everything just falls apart then. Ibn Juzay al-Kalbi says that you need to have 12 sciences. The first of these, he says, is tafsir. You need to at least understand what prior scholars derived, what understandings were derived from all those different scholars. And tafsir itself is a science. There's a way of how to do tafsir. Then, as a sub-branch of that, there is ta'wil now. And ta'wil itself also has a science. So tafsir and ta'wil, they go together. Because you've got 1/3 of the Quran, which is ayat muhkam, which you only need tafsir to elaborate. You don't go into interpretations of those ayats or allegorical interpretations. Then you've got ta'wil, which deals with the other 2/3, which are ayat mutashabih. And a majority of the signs are from the ayat mutashabih. As they pertain to eschatology, they are from the ayat mutashabih. They are allegorical, they are metaphoric, they require interpretation, and that has its own mannerism of how to do. And then there is qira'at. Now qira'at, there are 10 agreed upon qira'at, which are derived from the 7 ahruf. The ahruf are essentially the shell or the skeletons of the words. And then the qira'at differ on how those words are pronounced. So you can have a shell of a word that can be articulated as, for example, fatabayyanu. And then that same shell can also be expressed as fatathabbatu. And though the two meanings are similar, they are both also distinct. One gives a different kind of meaning, and they're both valid because they are part of the same ahruf. So knowing the qira'at, how different words are pronounced in the Quran, based on the different qaris that have been agreed upon, not just some random qira'at you picked up from somewhere, knowing how, you don't have to memorize the entire Quran and how each qira'ah is recited or how each version is recited, but you need to have a working knowledge of the 10 different recitations and how to distinguish the variances between the different recitations. And then there is ahkam. The ahkam is to do with the rules and the laws and the ordinances that are in the Quran, and also to do with the fiqh of studying the Quran. So there is a fiqh that goes alongside reciting the Quran. There is also a fiqh that goes alongside studying the Quran. What rules to observe, what etiquettes to observe, all those kinds of things. You need to understand that before you just open the book of Allah and start taking ayat out. Then comes the science of hadith, and that's actually the third of the major sciences of eschatology. Although Ibn Juzay puts it as a requisite knowledge of the science of Quran as well. Understanding how the hadith were compiled, how they were graded, what are the requisites of grading, what do each of those grades mean, how do the grades change, because there are times when a da'if hadith can be classified as da'if and then certain events happen, and then a muhaddith will examine that and say, no, based on this, he would look at, let's say, the chain of narration, find that is sound. He will look at other aspects, but then sees the context of what's being spoken and says, this does not fit any description. It seems to be a weak hadith, but then that event actually takes place, and that can change the da'if hadith into a hasan. So that variance can take place. Knowing how the science works. Hadith science is the most complicated sciences of all the sciences in our tradition. Hadith science is incredibly complicated because, it's a dangerous game trying to say, oh, I think this is what the Prophet said. I think this he did not say. I think this is false. I think this is correct. That's a very dangerous game somebody can play because they don't really know. You see? And so understanding also how it was transmitted, who were the transmitters, knowing their biographies as well comes into the science as well. Because some were known to be liars. Others were known to be having weaker memories in their later ages, but strong memories in their early ages. Others were known to be in the company of those who were ascribed to be truthful and sincere and honest. There were many different narrators and chains of narrations, and all these things have to be taken into account. Further to that, the language of the hadith is very different from the language of the Quran. The language of the hadith is basically the way the Prophet ﷺ spoke, but many of the hadith you will find are not verbatim. They are being re-quoted by the person who is narrating the hadith. So some aspects of the hadith, some phrases will be verbatim, word for word. Other aspects might be, Sami'tu Rasulullah, I heard the Prophet ﷺ say this. That in itself tells you something about the hadith. as opposed to Qala Rasulullah. That tells you something else about the hadith. Or Ra'aytu Rasulullah, I saw the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam do this. Or Sam'ayatu fulan fulan, Ra'a Rasulullah, I heard such and such person, he saw the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam say this or do this. You see, that in itself tells you something else about what's being, because it is now following the way that individual has narrated it, or the words that that person has chosen. So you'll find certain hadith, though they have the same contextual meaning, or they have the same subject matter, their terminologies will differ. And sometimes they will even differ across the dialects that was spoken at that time. So this is part of the science of hadith. Then comes usuluddin, which is to do with aqidah. It is, and this is a prime science. The scholars always held a principle: أهمها عقائد ثم الفروع تصوف وآلة بها شروع. The first and foremost is your principles or your creedal aspects, and that's usuluddin. This is what gives the intellect sound parameters when you start going into now things that affect your belief. Because you will find that, as I mentioned in one of the earlier episodes, in our tradition, eschatology was studied as part of aqidah. And so aqidah is vital insofar as the root or the base of the science of eschatology. That's where usuluddin comes in. Then comes usulul fiqh, which is not just the fiqh. It is now the asl of it. The reason why the law is in place, why you should be praying, why you should be doing this, what does it mean? So that you then don't start manipulating the fiqh in your own way and then foregoing the actual purpose of why that rule was put in place in the first place. Or you start subjecting your own intellection to saying, I think this is what it's supposed to be doing. I think this is what you see this, so many Muslims have now started bringing in this LGBTQ thing into our religion. In the West, there are now quote-unquote masajid that are fully integrated with men and women staying in a mixed, company in the masjid, praying Salatul Jama'ah. There would be a man next to them as a woman. One has a hijab, the other one doesn't have. A third one is wearing a miniskirt. The guy is wearing shorts. And then there's a woman leading the prayer. And then one person is standing the other way around, is facing backwards. Somebody is just lying down across there. I don't know. These are things that they start coming up because they start manipulating the fiqh to say, oh, it's like this and it's like that. It can work like this because like this. And they apply their own logic to the fiqh, which can be altered. It can be changed. It's dynamic. Islamic fiqh across all four schools of thoughts, it's never been rigid because it's supposed to be applicable to the changing circumstances. And more so in our age and time, there is actually a fiqh that is applicable to our age, to the age of the finality. The eschatological age has its own fiqh. But you cannot understand that fiqh if you don't understand the usul of fiqh, the principles where the axioms are laid out, right? You have to start with min al-ma'lum ila al-majhul. You have to start with the axioms and the principles before you then start figuring out how to apply that fiqh. Then you've got ilm al-qasas, which is the science of all the stories and the narrations that are in the Quran, but then further to that, how are they expanded? How are the scholars done further research and inquiry into these accountings that the Quran is providing, and what more information has been derived about them? And then all the sources from which this information has been derived. So you'll find someone like Imam al-Tabari is well recognized for his work in this field, where he looks at all these stories that have been accounted in the Quran, including those of which the individuals have no names. Like the individual who fell asleep for 100 years and one was resurrected and he saw the town had been rebuilt. Or the Ashab al-Kahf, who are only known as Ashab al-Kahf. They don't have names, or their names have not been mentioned. Or you've got Dhul Qarnayn, who is a key figure insofar as the eschatology is concerned. And that's not his name, that's a title. Dhul Qarnayn is a title. So you've got all these kinds of recountings, and then you've got multiple sources from other traditions who either contribute to the narration or they're actually the source of the narration. Like many of the stories that take place about the prophets, for example, many of the prophets are not mentioned in the Quran, but you will find them in the Jewish tradition that have a key role to play. Like Isaiah, for example, or Daniel, for example. Daniel. the Prophet Daniel or the Prophet Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, all these are Jewish prophets. They're not in the Quran, but they have got key prophecies with regards to the eschatology. Now you need to be able to study that in a way that does not conflict what the Quran is giving. So you need to understand how this is done. This is part of the study of history. And that's a requisite knowledge. It's not just about studying world history and the events that have been happening insofar as the mundane aspect is concerned, but history insofar as the prophetic enactment of events are taking place. This is one of the titles of my next book in the series of the One-Eyed Impostor, which examines the historical unfolding of events from the prophetic lens as far as the prophets were concerned. What did they do? What happened insofar as a repercussion of what they did, or the events that took place after and before them, and how they have contributed to what are called also pivotal events that changed the course of human history. And then there is ilmun naskh. Naskh is to do with, it's often translated as abrogation or cancellation, which I don't like that translation as well. And I don't like to translate the word in either case. It is to do with understanding insofar as the micro events of revelation, which is the revelation that was sent down to the Prophet ﷺ over 23 years. Within that micro, which were the aspects that were changed and altered, and why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says it in that ayah, we don't do naskh, nor do we cause something to be forgotten, except that we give something better or similar to it. Now, there are certain events that had taken place during the Prophet's lifetime that clearly fall under that category. For example, the Qibla was changed, the fasting was changed, punishment for adultery was changed. They were following the Jewish hudud on that, and then that was changed. Why was it changed? What caused that change? What impact did it have at that time, and what impact does it have going forward? That's in the micro scale. Then you've got the macro insofar as all of Revelation is concerned. And that's to do with now what was revealed in the Torah that ended up being altered or changed, let's say, in the Zabur, or that then ended up being changed or altered in the Injil, or that then later the Quran came in and said, no, that's to be changed, or affirmed what was to be followed before that change was made. So if something was changed in the Injil from the Torah, but then the Quran comes in and says, no, you have to follow what was in the Torah, not to follow what was changed afterwards. Understanding how this works and why this change was made. And this also falls into now comparative religion and theology, which is now another requisite knowledge of eschatology. Understanding how these dispensations that are involved, particularly what's known as the Abrahamic faiths, the three who fall under the umbrella of Nabi Ibrahim alayhi salam, the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims, and then you've got the other dispensations that are also sort of parallel to that, or not parallel, sort of, peripheral to that, I would say, like the Hindus, and then you've got the Buddhists, you've got, for a small minority, you've got the Zoroastrians, and then you've got other communities as well that have something to contribute towards eschatology, because they were also given revelation in their own respect. And there's a part of revelation that was provided to them with regards to the eschatology. As the Prophet ﷺ said, there's no Nabi but that he warned his people about the one-eyed impostor. So everyone has received a prophecy about that, and they have a certain understanding of that. And knowing that also is part of our study. Then you've got the language sciences that Ibn Juzayya highlights, Lugha, Bayan, Balagha, but expands further from that, because Lugha then contains Nahwu, Sarf, Ishtiqaq, Rasm, Insha, and then you've got Bayan, which includes Badi, Ma'ani, it also includes Sha'r, it also includes Khataba, and it includes Tariq and Adab. And then you've got the Mutun as well in there. So that's essentially to do with the language sciences. And then finally you've got Tasawwuf. So Tasawwuf is now part and parcel, because as we looked at in the previous session, we looked at the Hadith of Jibreel, and we found that there were 4 dimensions that we were looking at. There was Islam, Iman, what's known as Ihsan, but then Ihsan is not a science. Ihsan is what is meant to be arrived at. So you've got a science that will help you arrive at that or to achieve that. So Islam is not a science, but then you've got sciences like fiqh, which will help you fulfill those pillars, or you've got a science like aqidah, which will help you fulfill the pillars of iman. And this needs to be understood, by the way. Aqidah is not iman. Aqidah is a science. Iman is what needs to be fulfilled. The science only facilitates that. So in the same way, now you've got ihsan, which is what needs to be fulfilled. You've got sciences that will lead you to that. You've got things like tazkiyatun nafs, for example, the purification of the soul. You've got suluk, which is sort of a behavioral science. And then you've got like the purification of the heart. And these all essentially fall under tasawwuf, which is a broad science in and of itself. It is essentially the science of the pathway. And I know people have got issue with this word. I mean, if you don't like tasawwuf, that's fine, because like any other science, there are many things that have seeped into it that completely ruin the science itself. But tasawwuf is essentially, so take for example, you need to go to the airport, for example, and there are many ways that you can get there, and there are many instruments that you can use to get there. You can use a car, you can ride an elephant, you can go with the train, you can take the bus, you can walk if you're up for it, you can get into a horse carriage and get you there, or ride on a bicycle. All those components, those are all the means. They are the means to get you there. That's what the sciences of Islam are. Islam is what provides you with the means to reach the destination. The destination is the divine presence. That's where you want to arrive at. The means then require a sort of guidance, something that will help you be on the lookout for what to do, what not to do, how to do all those things. That's your iman now, your faith. It is your faith, because the aqidah, the usuluddin, these sciences will help your intellect maintain its course. So this is your preparation for the journey. You're going to the airport, you're going to get everything together. You'll put all your stuff together. You need this, you need that, you need your bag, you need your shoes, you need all these things. You're putting everything together. You're preparing for the journey. But you still need to make the journey. So you've got the means and you've got your provisions ready. Now, you need to know which road you're going to take. You need the navigation. You can take many roads, because there are many roads that will take you there. Some will have traffic, some will have potholes, some will have construction, some will have, will be dangerous. There'll be bandits on that road or something. So you need someone now who is going to give you a sort of a guide. He's going to take you along and say, okay, take a left here, take a right here. This place looks like there's a diversion, take it from here. Go off on the next exit and take the next route from there. This is now what tasawwuf is. Tasawwuf is going to show you the pathway. And that's why it was regarded as having a tariqah. A tariq is the direction in which you're going to go. And a tariqah was a direction that you followed based on somebody who had been recognized to have followed a similar path and made it to the destination safe and sound. And during his journey, he was able to point out and say, oh, there are issues here, there are issues there, they avoid this, watch out for this, look out for this, all these things, to tell you all the pitfalls and all the hurdles that you will encounter along the way. You see, so that you're following that person's tariqah because they have gone that route before and they are your guide. That's essentially what it is. Now, finding the right tariqah, that's where the issue lies, because there are many of these, imposters out there that say that they have a tariqah or they're having, they're following so and so, but they're not. They're doing a lot of bid'ah, they're doing a lot of shirk, they're making up a lot of things. They're in fantasy half the time. So this is where it earns a bad name. But this is why you need tasawwuf, because it will help you purify yourself to be able to receive understandings of those metaphysical realities, because those metaphysical realities, as we said, they are not arrived at through rational inquiry. They're not arrived at through empirical proof. You're dealing with unseen things. That's the realm of the heart now. It is an understanding that will be acquired in that dimension. But if the heart is diseased, and if the soul is tainted and impure, and it's following its own whims, then it's very unlikely you will arrive at a true understanding of no matter how much you study the science. You can study the whole science, memorize all the related hadith, all the kitab al-fitan in all the various books of hadith. Memorize all the ayats in the Quran. It's not going to give you an understanding. That's just the accumulation of a lot of information. To arrive at the understanding requires a cleansing of the heart. And this is why tasawwuf is a prime science, also in the science of eschatology, as it is in the sciences of the Quran. As Ibn Juzay al-Kalbi puts it, as one of the 12 of the science of the Quran, because the heart has to be pure in order to receive divine knowledge. Divine knowledge is pure by its inherent nature. And one cannot be impure to receive the pure. They both have to be pure. And that which is pure cannot descend at a level of impurity to match the other, because there has to be an intimate connection between the knower and the thing that is to be known. There has to be an intimate connection. That intimate connection cannot take place if one of them is impure. And naturally, the Quran will never be impure, which means you as the individual have to purify yourself in order to receive that knowledge. Then, just to finish up, there are other sciences that are requisites in the science of eschatology. Psychology is a prime science. Understanding the way people behave, understanding what are the things that define humanity in their mental states, in their spiritual states, because innamal a'malu binniyat, all actions are contingent on the intentions, and the intentions are of a spiritual nature. So whatever is manifesting in reality outside is as a result of what's happening in their internal aspects. Understanding the psychologies of the people who are actually enacting, actively participating in the enactment of the eschatological age, or setting the stage as you would have. Many of them are actually heedless of what they're doing. They are contributing factors, but they are heedless of that. And we need to understand their psychologies. Why are they heedless to something so obvious that we can identify and say, listen, isn't this Dajjalic or contributing to something that is Dajjalic? Why are you doing that? And the person says, I don't see anything, wrong with that. Like how people say when it was clearly proven that governments are actually spying on their people through their smart devices. Gathering information through their location and through all these means. And so many people came out and said, well, I don't have anything to hide. I don't see anything wrong with that. The government is saying that it's for our safety. It's for our this. I don't see anything wrong with that. People don't see anything wrong with posting their pictures on social media. They don't see anything wrong with, doing all these stupid things that they do and then taking videos and stuff and posting them on social media. I don't see anything wrong with that. You need to understand the psychology behind that. How is that psychology being drafted? How has it been fashioned? And how is it enacting? And how are these people able to justify themselves? And then more so the psychology of the greater players, the main players, those who are actually working actively to set the stage. What's their psychology? What's their mental state? That goes hand in hand with philosophy. Now, philosophy, I'm not going to spend too much time on that. It'll take me a long time to actually explain philosophy in more detail, but philosophy is paramount and is important because you need to understand the ideologies that are driving the enactments and that are being established as dominant ideologies, that people are actually adapting and are heedless to that because they don't even see it as an ideology. They don't even know that their thoughts are being fashioned by these ideologies, and they are cultivating and contributing to disparity and the fitan that is being widespread into the world. This goes hand in hand with logic. You cannot study philosophy without logic, and you need logic. And I wish I could spend more time on logic, because logic is a prime science in this. In fact, Imam al-Ghazali says that you cannot advance in any science without having logic as a requisite science first. He goes even further to say that anyone who does not study logic, their knowledge cannot be trusted for authenticity, which is a pretty bold statement to make. And I, for one, would agree with that. Because there are many people who come into the science of eschatology, they will either be regurgitating what other scholars have already said, meaning that they have not actually exerted any thought of their own into it, insofar as now philosophy is concerned, to understand now exactly what is the thought process involved. But then they will come up with their own theories that they are unable to see the flaws and the mistakes and the errors that they're making, the fallacies that they're making in those theories. And they will propagate and spread those theories as though it's absolute truth. And many of these end up leading other people astray. It leads them astray and it leads other people astray as well. Then you need to have the science of time and cosmology. We're going to talk about this in a later session with regards to the subject of time, but this also includes astronomy and physics. As we said, eschatology in essence is the study of time. But then what is time and how do you study it? And what is the relationship between time and the cosmos that we are existing in? Finally, you need epistemology. And this is what we covered in the previous session with the hadith of Jibril, which is the epistemology of Islam. And I'm going to talk about this in a future session as well to expand more. What is epistemology and what is the soundest epistemology to apply in the science of eschatology? This is all the time we have for today. سبحانك وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا يا مولانا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. بارك الله فيكم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.